I'm going to focus in this lecture on the political economy of China, and as is often the case, I'm going to start with a little historical background. By now, you should probably be aware that in the period of time during which China has been nominally under the rule of the Communist Party, its actual economic policies have been through some really significant shifts, and I'm going to divide those in very broad strokes into two periods: one under Mao and then one after Mao. The general thrust of China's economy under Mao is that the state runs the show. This is what is known as a command economy, in which the dictates of central planners are the primary force driving economic production. So under Mao, at least in theory, legally speaking, the state owns all property. It might decide to delegate the right to administer some property or to work some farmland to particular groups or individuals, but the state ultimately owns property. Most people work in what are known as state-owned enterprises. We're particularly talking here about in the manufacturing sector. And those folks benefit from a really nice deal colloquially known as the Iron Rice Bowl. This is to say that if you have a job in a state-owned enterprise, you are guaranteed lifetime employment. They will find a job for you somewhere. And that's also where your healthcare and your pension are going to come from. Of course, this isn't necessarily a super cushy deal given the general poverty of China at the time, but it does reflect the principle that the state is responsible for providing for the basic welfare of its workers. Central planning is a major feature of this economy. Bureaucrats in Beijing are generally responsible for determining what they want out of the economy overall on a regular basis, and then assigning production targets and quotas to individual enterprises and also to collective farms if we're thinking about agricultural production. And finally, it's worth noting that international trade under Mao is pretty limited for a couple of reasons. One is that there is a strategic decision to pursue some degree of autarky, of independence in China's economic production. The other is that during the Cultural Revolution, for ideological reasons, China is going to minimize its outreach to the rest of the world. After Mao's death in 1976, under Deng Xiaoping and his successors, China's policy will shift considerably to a different period known as reform and opening. In this period, the idea is that the government should reduce its degree of control over the economy. And I guess it would be helpful at this point to pause and just try and do a really cursory evaluation of the results of Mao's policy. On the one hand, he achieves a number of his high-level goals. China makes significant progress towards industrializing. Remember that at the time of the revolution, of the establishment of the PRC, China is not only an overwhelmingly agricultural country, but also a country that's emerging from about 20 years of war. And so China's industrial base will develop significantly under Mao. On the agricultural level, improved irrigation systems will be helpful. The infrastructure base will to some degree be created for improved agricultural productivity. Inequality will be reduced. That kind of old system of feudalism in the countryside is very forcibly done away with under Mao. Health and education outcomes and literacy rates will improve over the course of Mao's leadership. But there are two significant caveats that we should attach to that evaluation. One, China is still a poor country in 1976. And number two, the Maoist era carries with it just some catastrophic famine and chaos and political instability, particularly in the times of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. And so to say that China has achieved significant steps toward economic development in that period is by no means to endorse the idea that that was worth the cost. I'll leave that normative evaluation to you. Okay, so fast forward to the post-Mao period, there is a decision taken under Deng Xiaoping and his successors that China needs to start liberalizing its economy. And this is going to come in a series of waves of policy reform. One of those is that economic decision-making is going to be decentralized. Central planning isn't totally abolished. There's to this day some degree of high-level central economic planning done by the Chinese Communist Party. But a lot of economic decisions are going to be outsourced from Beijing to the provincial and the county and the village and even the commune level. In agriculture, land is going to be decollectivized. Some of the policies introduced during the Great Leap Forward are going to be reversed, and a new program will come into play called the Household Responsibility System. Under the system, the state, the collective, the village technically retains ownership of farmlands, but individual families are now allowed to manage farm production, to decide what they're going to grow and who's going to do the work and what they're going to do with it. They simply have to pay taxes, and that's going to lead to a significant increase in agricultural productivity. China is also going to open up to foreign investment in this period. And the baby step here is the creation of these special legal entities known as special economic zones. These are designated areas, and the first ones are all in cities on China's coast, where the rules regarding foreign investments and ownership of assets are significantly relaxed. And the government actually goes out of its way to encourage foreign investment and to liberalize the restrictions on exports and imports. So that starts out as kind of a trial program. This is a good illustration of how a unitary system can actually use devolved policymaking or local policy experiments in some cases to kind of try out reforms that will later be implemented at the national scale. And so over the course of those 40 years after Mao, China is going to gradually liberalize its economy. In 2001, the outside world will really pay attention to this when China joins the World Trade Organization and agrees, at least in theory, that it's going to play by a similar set of rules to most of the other countries in the world. The World Trade Organization today spends a whole bunch of its time pursuing China for alleged violation of trade rules, but at least in principle, this is a really significant step to China acknowledging that trade is the present and future of its economy, and that participating in global trade might mean playing by a global set of rules. The results of this, I think, are best illustrated with this very simple graph of gross domestic product in China. Covers the period from 1985 to 2020, plus a little forecast into the future. You can see just a massive growth in the size of China's economy. And you might find it useful to look at some other economic statistics as well that try to measure China's economy in different ways. But if you're in my class, we will most likely do some of that together. So, what is the economy of China now? The answer is it is not a free market economy. It is not a pure capitalist system. It does not significantly resemble that of, say, the United Kingdom or the United States or even of Mexico. I think the system, you'll see different kind of terms bandied about. One is sort of market socialism, is I think the term that's now somewhat common in China. Another, which you see outside analysts use a lot, is state capitalism. So here we need to kind of do that thing where we say, well, it's a little from column A and a little from column B. On the one hand, in the reform and opening period, there's been a gradual decline in the number of state-owned enterprises, or SOEs. That's a really common term in discussing the Chinese economy, and it's what it sounds like. It's businesses that are directly run by the state. On the other hand, the state continues to be actively involved in a number of sectors. The 12 biggest firms in China are still state-owned enterprises. Natural resources are still nationalized. State-owned enterprises still account for 25% of industrial output in China. And the state's focus has been particularly concentrated in maintaining state-owned enterprise dominance in sectors that the party considers strategic. So some examples of those are energy and transportation and telecommunications. In addition to that, even nominally private firms, often a big chunk of their stock will be owned by the state, and that gives the state and the party some degree of influence through economic as well as through political mechanisms. The remaining state-owned enterprises still have significant competitive advantages. They might get subsidies from China's government. They might get cheaper credit from China's state-owned banks. They might enjoy privileged access to China's domestic or foreign markets. So long story short, the share of the economy that is dominated by state-owned enterprises has markedly declined in the reform and opening period, but that does not mean that state-owned enterprises are no longer a meaningful force in China's economy. In fact, this is not just a sign that liberalization is incomplete or that China is still working to kind of do away with the vestiges of the Maoist economy. Instead, it's a model that's actively embraced by the Chinese government and that the Chinese government is increasingly trying to promote as a model for other developing economies to follow. You might, at some point in my class, have learned about the term Washington Consensus, which refers to the set of recommendations that started crystallizing in the 1980s when the US and the IMF and the World Bank all started recommending basically the same policies of liberalization for developing countries, often attaching them to loans or to aid being granted to those countries. So the term Washington Consensus refers to what used to be the really popular idea that the way for developing countries to get richer is to liberalize their economies, to minimize state involvement. More recently, though, we've started to see bandied about in the press and among observers the term Beijing Consensus, which refers to the idea that there is a different way for developing countries to get wealthier, to develop their economies, and that is by having the state take this very active role in leading the economy, right? So there's a good deal of room for private enterprise. There's a fairly capitalist element to this economy, but this does not mean that the state is abandoning its role, particularly in those strategic sectors. A couple of challenges to think about in terms of China's economy, right? Because this unquestionably has resulted in really massive economic growth and in a corresponding boost to the legitimacy of the Communist Party. But that doesn't mean that everything is gravy. And there's a couple of things to pay attention to if you're looking for ways in which China's economy could potentially destabilize its politics. Number one, the abolition of the iron rice bowl, the declining role of state-owned enterprises, the increasing importance of private enterprises, which are operating on a for-profit basis as employers of Chinese labor, means that we have increasing labor mobility. People are no longer guaranteed jobs for life. They are often displaced by factory closures or by competition with other companies. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. A lot of sort of standard free market economists will tell you that some people should change jobs on a regular basis in order to keep things productive and efficient. But the end of guaranteed employment means that people are subject to dislocation and uncertainty and the possibility of long-term unemployment. And all of that can have political repercussions if people feel a decreasing sense of security in their lives. Number two is inequality. Overall, economic inequality in China has increased significantly. The Gini index in 1978 was 16. In 2016, it was 38.5, which made China in that year more unequal than Russia or the United Kingdom or Nigeria. So overall, inequality has absolutely increased. And incidentally, China today has more billionaires than any other country in the world. In addition, we've seen regional inequality. So I've talked about this before when we've done a lecture on Chinese society. But the coastal provinces in China tend to benefit more from economic liberalization, from foreign direct investment, from trade, from export-oriented development. And the inland provinces tend to be more poor. So we tend to see a lot of west to east migration, and we also similarly see rural to urban migration. Migration, in turn, presents a serious political challenge for the government to solve because of the legacy of the Maoist era in the form of something known as the hukou, which is a kind of domestic passport, a local household registration. In China, as I think I've said before, if you, in order to get access to services that are provided by the local government, you have to have this hukou, this registration document, which says that you're legally entitled to access those benefits. And rural migrants have a really, really difficult time getting a hukou for the urban areas to which they migrate, which means that there's this huge population in China, 250 million and counting, of migrant workers who mostly don't have equal access to healthcare, to pensions, to unemployment benefits, to schooling for their kids, to subsidized housing in the cities where they actually work and live. And that could, in the future, present a significant challenge to China's social and political stability. Problem number three, as China has industrialized, there have been just massive negative consequences for the environment. Resources have been depleted, forests have been cut down, areas of China are rapidly turning into desert. The air, particularly in major Chinese cities, is often very, very polluted, and so are water supplies. China is a major, major emitter of greenhouse gases, contributing to climate change. And so all of these are really pressing issues for China. To its credit, the government has recognized that environmental protection is a really urgent and pressing issue, in part because there has been significant protest in China and significant non-governmental organization activity calling for the government to do more to protect the environment, calling for manufacturers to be more responsible in being mindful of their impacts on the environment. But it's unclear how much economic growth the state is willing to sacrifice in the name of environmental protection. And so this is an interesting area to watch, particularly if you're interested in the way that civil society operates in China. The kind of big existential question for China's economy is whether growth can continue. In the reform and opening era, China has just seen massive, unprecedented, world-beating economic growth at relatively sustained rates. But in the last 10 years or so, that economic growth has slowed down. And that's raising a lot of uncertainty among China's political elite about whether they can keep up the pattern or whether a slowdown in the rate of economic growth will threaten their legitimacy. The basic bargain that China has offered to its people is if you are okay with us continuing to be an authoritarian regime, we will provide sustained economic growth and an improvement in the quality of life. We will allow you to expect that your kids will be better off than you were and that you will be better off than your parents were. And if economic growth slows down, it's not 100% clear that bargain will continue to hold up. So this is, I think, kind of the big existential question for China's regime, is whether it can continue delivering on that implicit bargain of authoritarianism in exchange for sustained growth. There are two major political factions in thinking about how to manage this conundrum. These are both factions within the Chinese Communist Party, but it's significant to watch who gains power and who gains significant positions because they do have some genuine policy differences. One of those factions is known as the populists. These tend to be people who are individually from more humble backgrounds, and their ideology tends to focus on promoting economic equality and building a stronger safety net. They say we need to be attentive to the human consequences of this rapid economic development. We need to make sure that the benefits are equally distributed across all Chinese. The other faction is known as the elitists, or sometimes the princelings, because a lot of these people are the sons of former high-ranking Communist Party officials. They're in kind of the second generation of party leadership, and these people tend to be more focused on economic efficiency and on continued liberalization. The line between these factions is not always super clear. So, for instance, President Xi Jinping is regarded as a princeling, but has also made it a sustained focus of his administration to try and tackle rural poverty in China. Both factions are interested in economic growth. Both factions are interested in improving general welfare in China. But this division suggests that that question about how to continue economic growth and how to manage economic growth is a central political issue that divides even members of the Chinese Communist Party from one another. Lastly, and I'm turning here to the current issues section of your textbook, we need to talk a little bit about corruption in China. Corruption isn't new in China, but it has increased markedly in the reform and opening era. There is an estimate from China's central bank that officials between the 1990s and the 2000s smuggled $125 billion out of China, presumably because they had obtained that money in various corrupt dealings. So, a couple of reasons why both public and private sector corruption are major concerns in China. And growing concerns for China in the reform and opening period. Most basically, just as China has gotten richer, the spoils of corruption potentially are much greater. There is more money for corrupt officials to steal. Number two, as decision making has been decentralized, the range of officials who are in a position to solicit bribes or to otherwise improperly profit from their offices has increased, and the ability of the party to supervise them has not necessarily kept pace with that growth. Number three, because China is an authoritarian country, the level of transparency is low. The rule of law is not consistently implemented throughout the country. Courts aren't necessarily independent enough to actually enforce anti-corruption laws against particularly high-ranking officials. And the press is not necessarily free to expose acts of corruption. And all that makes it more difficult to point out corruption where it occurs and to prosecute it when it can be proven. Finally, and this is a slightly different angle on the problem of corruption, sometimes bribes are paid because people want economic activity to happen. There's an idea in the academic scholarship around corruption that refers to the idea of market facilitating corruption, which means, somewhat paradoxically, that occasionally paying a bribe can actually be good for the overall economy if it, for instance, speeds up the permitting process. If you're trying to build a factory, people will be able to work in that factory quicker if that factory is built quicker, regardless of whether getting it built quicker reflects legal or illegal activity. And so a good deal of corruption in China reflects just the desire of people in both the public and the private sector to just make things go faster. One other term you'll often see when you're reading about corruption in China is the idea of guanxi, which means relationships or personal connections. This isn't necessarily inherently corrupt, but it refers to the broader idea, which has been true for much of China's history under the PRC, that personal relationships can help you get stuff done. So you might be more likely to get a job if the person doing the hiring is from the same town as your family or a distant relative of you or went to the same school. Those same kinds of connections might make it easier for you to get a contract for your business to do some work for the state, or to get a building permit to build something or to tear something down. This isn't necessarily inherently corrupt, but it's also not necessarily that efficient. And there's been a significant push in the reform and opening period to try and reduce the influence of guanxi in people's day-to-day economic transactions and to make things a little bit more official, a little bit more by the book. Last note on this point. Xi Jinping, when he came to office, made pursuing official and unofficial corruption his highest priority. He announced when coming to office a major campaign against corruption. And in the 6 years between 2012 and 2018, he launched 2.7 million investigations of party officials for corruption. 1.5 million of those people were punished, and 58,000 criminal trials resulted. This campaign, he stated at the beginning, a little bit poetically, was going to pursue both tigers and flies. And In other words, both high and low ranking officials. Some people were going to be pursued for low level corrupt transactions. Some people were going to be pursued for these massive publicity making cases as an example to others. It's worth remembering here that she has at his disposal in this campaign not just the official state court system, but also the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which is that Communist Party body that has the power to demote or expel party members. And that actually has done the majority of the work in Xi's anti-corruption campaign. Most of the people who are being disciplined for corruption are suffering their consequences from the party, not from the state. Finally, a lot of cynically minded commentators on this have noted that the anti corruption campaign has also been a helpful opportunity for Xi to prosecute and, in some cases, to imprison some people who are potentially his political rivals. And the most famous example of this is a Communist Party leader named Bo Xilai. Bo was a rising star in the Communist Party. He was a member of the Politburo, that 25-member body that makes a lot of the really important decisions within the party. He was the party chief for Chongqing, which is one of the major cities in China. He was kind of widely regarded as a candidate for the Politburo Standing Committee and potentially eventually as a successor to Xi Jinping, maybe even a rival for leadership. He was arrested and then imprisoned, and he's still in prison today in 2013 on massive corruption charges. And this was regarded as a major victory for the anti-corruption campaign, but possibly also as a signal to Xi's other political rivals that anybody who threatened his hold on power could potentially find themselves accused of corruption. I'm sure we'll talk more about that when I see you next. Thanks very much.